Maybe to start with a very, very quick questions for the panel, but then I would like to open up that to the floor to have you engaging with with them. So I was really struck by your paper when you Serena, you said about the role of translation as a kind of moving forward. That was the idea that struck me with as a tool to move into progress, away from backwardness. So maybe if you can elaborate a bit more on this by also saying why is necessary to kind of translate the language of the campaign you mentioned about LGBT rights. So why is it important that we borrow that terminology, and is there not a linguistic repertoire or thematic repertoire we can draw on without necessarily having to borrow terms without really engaging with them in a way that you said, that they borrowed without really showing awareness of the context they come from, or the specificity and the nuances that they come from. So, and then for you, very quickly, I wanted to ask you, Juliet, what is your then solution about the use of asterisks? Are you proposing? Are you in favor of the use of a different solution like the X, or are you? How do you position yourself in dialogue with those who oppose, like Cecilia Augustelli, who don't really oppose it, but says that it's not yet time maybe to use it, can be not well received and so on. And maybe just for you, Cinzia, just expanding or say a bit more about how the use of Darlo maybe can be explained differently if we look at other contexts. We had a chat last night about has it been used in LGBT context?
I don't know because now, of course, the first to answer. I'm at the point that I know I'll have to look at contemporary writings, and of course, I can probably I cannot remain just stick with just narrative. I have to look at other types. But I really need help from people who know this type of literature to give me, suggestions on where I should look. And it's very likely that, within those contexts, it's used in a different way that, points to finally a breaking of the asymmetry.
Yeah, because
in both verbs, of course, right?
Yeah, certainly, because my intake when I hear about studies of linguistic asymmetry is that they start with a notion of male and female, which are kind of no question, and then they say there's an asymmetry towards the use of female or male, depending on what. But then there's not a question of, let's look at the context in which Darla, because Darla can be used also in the gay, gay counter language, Darla, as opposed to only, referring to cis women, as opposed to
and this is what
women.
You don't find. I mean, you find. I've read Buzzi, for example, and I was telling you, but Buzzi doesn't use it. He uses Darlo once, but with a new meaning, because it's actually said by a woman to him. So again, you have to find the right texts, sources, absolutely.
So maybe very quickly, as you can answer this, and then we'll open up to.
So what I was trying to do is to offer a critique. So I guess because I'm not a linguist, I come into this field seeing what seems to me a bunch of a set of blind spots around an investment in evolution of language, and therefore, which therefore kind of implies that by borrowing and thinking of translation in a very particular way as an instance of borrowing and then furthering, and I'm trying to kind of problematize the temporalities of this and the investments in what kind of progress and what kind of and what does it mean to kind of organize a language of liberation. But I'm not saying that then translation becomes an exhaustive paradigm altogether. I'm thinking of changing the tropes through which we describe translation. So rather than seeing two reified national cultures that are kind of isolated entities, like separate entities that speak to one another with this kind of epistemological trope of crossing, instead of seeing that, looking at a more transnational model to look at translation. And in this case, I'm kind of suggesting, I'm looking at a model of interrogation. So looking at the way in which when Italian subjects, Italophone subjects, borrow a language that is clearly entrenched in an Anglophone tradition of liberation as well, when they borrow that, I'm suggesting that they kind of interrogate that model, because they necessarily then adapt those vocabularies and those buzzwords to a completely different setting. And so in terms of, I don't see translation so much, so I'm trying to criticize the idea that we have a place to move forward to. I'm also trying to problematize the idea, so I brought in debates on the sexual democracy, which are also debates on what Jasbir Puar calls homonationalism, by kind of trying to identify a stage in modernity, in late modernity, when sexual liberation gets used as a marker of modernity, and therefore with a racist kind of agenda of setting out a set of European and Western spaces and locales as more advanced, because they treat gays well, in that kind of rhetoric of, but they hang gays in Iran and we don't. So there's a very formed, interesting literature on all of that, and I'm asking, where does Italy lie in this scholarship, when Italy is certainly a Western country, certainly has historically made a claim for modernity through sexualized constructions, but at this particular point in history, it's behind in a set of ways. So how do we kind of then problematize this the rhetoric of backwardness? And I think with queer studies, there's been so much talk on backwardness, feeling backwards, and kind of futurity, what the future is, and what kind of tropes of social change can a queer model give us, as opposed to a kind of linear progressive model, a liberal model. So really, I'm kind of trying to get translation studies, queer studies, in dialogue with each other, to then question models of linguistic inquiry which seem limited to me.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, so my solution actually is really just conversation. So I mean, I'm coming at this not as a linguistic and inviting kind of a cultural perspective similarly. And with that, I'm trying to draw connections between this notion of visibility, and it seems obvious to me that the digital landscape and even things like these television shows, visibility is sort of I'm looking at reaching beyond kind of academic intellectual circles, but into a mass situation. We were just talking in an earlier panel about Morante saying sono scrittore, right? Scrittrice. Why not, right? Why not give visibility? But of course, then the problem is, so on the one hand, yes, yes, that gives visibility to a population that that doesn't have that representation. But then, of course, it's excluding another population. So, maybe it is the asterisk, the X, I don't know. But what I really advocate for is the conversation.
Okay. All right, so I'd like to hear from the public, from you, if you have questions, following on what has been said so far.
I have a question which is for all speakers, and including you, Michela. Yeah. It seems to me, and of course this is something that is very much inscribed in the tradition of linguistics, and for that matter also of translation, that there's a tradition of prescriptive linguistics and there's a tradition of descriptive linguistics. How do you see the tension in what you are doing, in the way in which we're reflecting now on gender and language, between a descriptive sort of ethos and a descriptive goal, which is to see what is happening and historically to see how things are changing and so on, and on the other hand, this kind of pressure to come up with the solution, which then takes us towards a descriptive territory, where, as was implicit into the observations that were made about Robbie Stelly's position, we are then on very slippery slopes often.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can just answer really quickly. I think Loredana's questions gets to the heart of my concerns around that kind of setup where there's a gender equality that we expect the Italian language to perform, and we're quite disappointed when it doesn't do that. And I'm asking, that model has a history. I'm more interested in kind of in looking at that history and where it comes from, and then rather than kind of presuming and prescribing a deficiency in Italian for it not being like that. And I also Michela's point earlier about so is there a kind of binary between American solutions or Northern European solutions and then authentically Italian solutions? And I know that my work risks verifying that kind of binary, because that's the translation studies kind of hazard in a sense, but I feel very strongly that that's not the direction in which I'm interested in going, and that rather so I don't think that there's a really interesting work on the Russian. There's a Russian scholar, Brian Baer, who's looked at how at several points in so Russia is definitely exposed globally as the homophobic site par excellence right now, and he's looking at how the use of the word gay, and so a kind of visible outward language, has actually coincided with repression and kind of legal backlash against certain bodies and subjectivities. So I'm also thinking, does visibility and does the speakable always really kind of match on to new possibilities of living and spaces? I think that there's a lot there to kind of disentangle.
By the way, as a parenthesis, I'm not implying the description is neutral, because being descriptive is just as political often, by the way.
Yeah, just probably I wanted to pick up on this by I wanted to mention the big debate and the genealogy of translation study, the descriptive moment in the 80s and the 90s, as opposed to the kind of return to the prescriptive moment with the activism and the sociological turn in translation study, which both describes but also kind of prescribes way of following up on changes that are already there. So I would say I'm not against prescriptivism when this prescriptivism is partially like a realization of the change that is already there, and the fact that we're not apply that change in the use of everyday language, and we're excluding something because of what was the tradition there. I'm thinking about the fact that we already have a lot of profession. I mean, if we talk about also the debate about the use of terms like senatrice, senatore, ministro, ministra, avvocata, as opposed to avvocatessa, which does no derogative but it's not as well accepted. So I'm thinking about the fact that society has changed, and the fact that in my case, when I talk about the Drag King book, we have like people, their bodies that want to be portrayed in a sense in which they portray themselves and they define themselves every day. So why should I not, because the grammar doesn't allow me to do it? The grammar allows that me to do, because the grammar has the possibilities. It's just simply us not thinking that the grammar can be changed, but the grammar can change, and actually has the whole possibilities there. It's simply us to be able to recognize that and apply them. And so in a sense, yes, I'm prescribing something, but not in a sense that I'm imposing. I'm simply following what are the instances and the demands of people who identify like that. If I talk about gender inclusiveness, in a sense, let's include the trans, because trans are already talking about themselves with the asterisks. So why am I in a position not to include that? That's not prescriptiveness by its probably, in a sense. Prescriptiveness has to do with with taking part and taking position about this. So, and as you said, also description is never neutral. So we're not really battling between something that is neutral as opposed to something that is. So this is my intake. It's trying to basically just expanding on a use and moving away from these ideas which were basically based simply on use and tradition, based on also patriarchal ideas and sexism. Yeah,
I'm very much with you. I mean, prescriptivism never really worked. It doesn't work. I mean, if you just take a very simple cases like with the third person indirect object pronoun, the he versus they, I mean, there is a movement towards accepting, even in legitimate grammar, also for grammars for foreign students. But the truth is that the change had occurred so long ago, and so I think if I understood you well, it's usage that determines the language, and prescriptivism is there, but eventually prescriptivism will accommodate itself to the usage.
I think you make a really great point though about the speed of the evolution of language right now, and again, I think a lot of that has to do with these sort of new forms of communication, and so it seems almost inevitable that things will be constantly reinvented, and that's that seems both productive and counterproductive at the same time. But that tension, I think, is also a rich ground where there's creativity and exploration.
Absolutely.
But it does mean that, I know this is, explicitly postmodern, but that we're constantly, we're never arriving at that, okay, now it's Latinx and, it'll change again. And, I guess it's back to the communication and being open to those developments.
Can I ask a question? So who makes the change? So that's my problem, actually. So are they the grammaticians, the lexicographers, the activists, the scholars, the linguists in general? So who proposes it? Where are we? Because we are also talking about we, but who are we?
Yeah.
So, the groups.
I think that's an incredibly useful question, because so I see the dictionary, for example, as the product of the power-knowledge relation, as opposed to some kind of site of liberation. So that's the dictionary. The dictionary comes out of a particular concern with a standardizing language and also with a particular relation between standard language and the national project, national building projects. That's why I'm kind of saying sexual citizenship then just becomes a particular an anxiety within a project of national modernity, which also has a kind of linguistic counterpoint then. So dictionaries do a particular work, and then I see movements as doing a very different work that is more complex, without wanting to then idealize movements either, social movements, I mean.
But from the historical linguist perspective, functional historical linguist perspective, is change comes from the speakers. That's it. I mean, that's the canonical, the people who use the language, language users,
from the bottom.
not even speakers, because